So you guys have seen this, I'm sure, multiple times. Here's our essential components. We're going to hit the database problem-solving one today. And if you haven't seen this definition, here it is. It's wonderful. But what does it mean? What does it mean to be data-based or data-driven? What does it mean to you?
Takes out some of the guesswork.
Takes out the guesswork. That's great.
I think being as objective as possible, keeping the subjectivity, or minimizing the subjectivity of it.
Yeah. How many people have been teaching or in the game for a while? Right? Do you remember the days when you come to a meeting and be like, well, you know, he doesn't listen, he doesn't do his work, and no data. Huh? That meeting today?
Today?
Yeah. Oh, that's sad. But I mean,
We're working on it.
right. But that's kind of how, like, that was just what was expected in the past, right? So it was all about, you know, what was wrong with the child and what we're seeing, and there wasn't a database situation. And now the data we live and die by our data. We had a meeting with John Youngquist yesterday, and he said he literally checks Tableau every 2 hours. Like, he is that neurotic about school success and data. And I don't think he'd be offended by me saying it. It's just like, that's his thing, you know? And so, and why is he doing that? To see the fluctuations in our data. And are the systems that we're putting into place actually effective? Or, you know, are we going in the wrong direction? Here we have our problem-solving process. Again, I believe that Leah has this tattooed on her back because we use it so much. It's those things that we see all the time. We start with defining it, analyzing it, implementing, and then evaluating.
And I think that we put that slide in there today to think about, not only do we want to use that process on the individual student level, but we really want to push our thinking to ensure we're using that process at the system level as well. And I think some of us have gotten really good, and I've heard a few comments, good at using it kid by kid, or maybe for a couple kids at a time, but when we think about all of our data in our building, are we using that same thinking to define systems?
And so, just like Angelique said, you know, looking at it, what are our systems data telling us? How many of you in the room do pull the data from Tableau or have the opportunity to look at it? Right? And so, is anyone in here doing things after looking at it, trying to change things around or making modifications based on what you're seeing? Yeah. Like, can you talk about that?
Some of the things that we did before break, we looked at some of our Tableau data to sort of see where some of our big issues were coming from in terms of behaviors. I know at East our 7th graders have completely gone crazy, and so looking at some of those pieces, and so some of it was just a structural piece. How do we make it so that all of these kids are not in the halls at the same time in the same small space? So making some of those structural changes, but then also looking at, okay, what universal system of support do we have in place that's holding the students accountable and holding the teachers accountable as well? And so one of the things you realize is our handbook is not done. And so then taking that time to create that handbook, to create what I think is a very basic structure and support system where everybody's kind of on the same track, which is huge as well. And so those were two of the places that we looked at the data to start making some changes.
That's fantastic. Anyone else?
We're doing, just as a part of a variety of competitions, we have the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade competition. One of the factors is weekly ADAs will be for each grade level. Grade level has a nice ADA and most points. Everybody earns points, but and then we translate it to other things and reports and so on. You can just jump in and pull that.
That's awesome. And is your attendance improving?
Yeah, we've actually gone from 90, you just handed the sheet, 93% ADA 2 years ago to about 95%.
Fantastic.
Average data. So obviously everyone. That's a big learning curve for me.
Yeah, we're going to spend some time looking at this data in just a moment, and we can navigate it.
And I think sometimes, we think about Tableau. For those of you that haven't used it, you don't think about it at we tend to use it in terms of attendance and behavior a lot, but the data around our, our students that have D's and F's or our proficiency data, those are things that we can look at as well to then determine changes for our systems. When I used to work at Crawford, and hopefully Sylvia agrees with me on this, we used to look at behavior data all the time, and then we would send out different,
Just looked at yesterday.
Did you?
Yeah.
Good. And we would send out suggestions and ideas based around, the problems that we're seeing. So if there was a lot of hallway concerns, right, so then we would ask the teachers to stand out in the hallway during transitions. Or if, the main area of concern was the media center, and we would try to go in and meet with that teacher and give that teacher some extra supports. And so data, at times it can be overwhelming, but it can also be your best friend if you utilize it in a proper way. So you've all been kind of checking out your data while we've been talking here, and those are all the different pieces that are on there. If you don't have Tableau access, then I would recommend talking to your administrator to see if you can get it, because it's wonderful. There's so many things on there that you can use to really dive into the data within your schools. So as far as problem-solving structures, what do you guys have in place already? I know that there's we have MTSS teams that a lot of times we're working on talking about individual students, but as Angelique said, sometimes the systemic things kind of get left out. What kind of systems do you have within your buildings that work on systemic concerns? So Leah, when you came to that, where did that come out? Were you just like hanging out over break and you're like, oh,
It was
check out some Tableau?
our restorative practices administrative meeting. So we have those, we have IDT teams, so we are grouped into interdisciplinary teams. And we have a team that's specifically the sped co-op team. We have a team that specifically are NAP students for English language learning. And we have an advanced team, and then we have, general ed team. And so within the IDT teams, and then also within our PLCs, we have some of those conversations as well. Like right now, PLCs are supposed to be really digging into the acuity data to really see where we're going, and then we're trying to make some tweaks because at least at the 8th grade level, the literacy pacing guides, they were kind of changed in the middle of first quarter. And so they're not really lined up with acuity right now, and so having to go in and say, this is what we're going to be teaching, so that then that can then go back and the acuity can then line up with what we're teaching. So some of those systems are in place.
So at Frontier, instead of having a bunch of small committees, we just have 3 big committees. So we have MTSS, instructional leadership, and then PBIS. So a third of the teaching staff is on each of those, and then you get to have a more global view of what's happening in the school, because one person from each grade level is on one of each of those teams. So that's been really nice.
Now, is their job to then share that information with their team, or does it go, because that's like a whole mass information go out to the whole staff?
So we do things like the weekly bulletin, there'll be a blurb about each one of those things in that. We have time at our whole staff meetings to talk about that, and then in our grade level team meetings, the people will be sharing whatever they brought back from their committee. So that seems to be working pretty well right now.
One of the things I heard that I really liked was that it's coming out in staff meetings. I think a lot of times that we try to minimize the amount of time or maximize our time, right, by sending out emails all the time. But you guys obviously know that how many emails do you read a day, or do you read very thoroughly? And if you send a 2-pager that has all these different tips and ideas and concerns and problems and all that, are you really going to get to the bottom and focus on every single little thing that's in there? Superintendent Munn sends out a superintendent's bulletin. I can say I probably read the entire thing once, maybe twice, and I've been APS for 4 years, don't tell me that. But it's the reality.
Going over there, I'm telling him right now.
But it's also, one of the other realities that we face is when to do it. Obviously we have a new administrator, so there's all kinds of transitional pieces that are happening that are necessary, with them finding the time to do it. And most of our staff in East, their version, and Jake and Angelique know this, their version of IST or MTSS is here's the kid, go fix it, please.
Yeah.
And so there's not, it's, trying to build some capacity within our MTSS team to look at the problem-solving process, to look at what are universal best practices other than just a catchphrase, right? To then take that back to start building some capacity with our interdisciplinary team structures as well.
I like that, and especially like dedicating the time and making sure that everybody's aware that this is problem-solving time. Like, the job of this meeting is to define the problem, analyze it, evaluate it, implement it. I think that's where we're struggling at Vaughn, is that there aren't those systems in place to make it a systematized problem-solving process. That it is, it's, oh, here's the problem, great. Okay, here's the goal, okay, how do we get there? Did it work? We have no idea because we're not dedicating the time to that.
And we ran into that very much last year, and so our changes for this year, we've got late start Wednesdays at the second grade middle school, so a different conversation from the elementary PR days, but we divide our Wednesdays into two functions only, and one is our C3s, or EAS and TSS support, and our PLCs. And so this week was extended PLC time from 8 to 9:30. Everybody's in the PLCs, they're doing new programming about their respective content. Next Wednesday, we're going to be in the grade level C3s. There's members from the MTSS teams on each of those. There's a protocol to go over everything from celebrations to student concerns to reviewing caseloads to all of that. And that was because it was the here you go MTSS team fix-it conversation last year. And we let know MTSS is not the place you take your car for the oil change.
That is awesome.
Anyway, so, and it's been really helpful. We've only had 3 of those meetings so far. And the first one was, I'm not just going to tell you who I'm concerned about, you're going to go do something about it. So we worked through that. Yeah. And now we're going through, what does it mean to define the problem? What is it when you're talking about a kid? And defining the problem doesn't look like, well, if you only, the parents only, because we've had some of those conversations.
And that's tough, right? Because a lot of times we like to focus on our deficits instead of our assets, but that doesn't really get us anywhere. So Steve, are you seeing a difference, like a shift in the culture based off of that, or is there some pushback?
Most of the pushback came later in the year last year, with this idea that, it was kind of being able to accept the concept that, guys, some of the kids we work with are challenging, and it's okay. But that means you have to do things differently. And what does that mean? And acknowledging the fact that none of us went to college to get affective training. And sometimes what we're dealing with a middle school student is not only an instructional component, but it's an affective component. And so we go back to the sort of cognitive engagement, affective engagement. What do those two things look like? And so we've given ourselves permission to say, gosh, I'm not sure how to support these kids, so who can I ask for help? And that's probably been the biggest leap, because we've gone from the you fix them to, okay, I'm willing to learn about this as long as you're willing to let me be messy about it.
It's a great point to bring up. John Youngquist, he talks a lot about people having their second job, and that second job is trying to pretend like you know everything, right? And the reality is we don't. You can really just crush yourself by doing that. And then think about what that does for your relationships with the people that you work for. You're really not credible at that point. Part of being a MTSS facilitator is you're one that connects people, right? You connect students with resources, you connect teachers with resources, and you try to bring things together so that we can maximize the supports for our kiddos. Does anybody else want to talk about their systems that they have?
Sylvia, do you want to share about your data teams at all?
Yeah,
If you can kind of summarize.
our data teams by grade levels kind of function more like an IST, MTSS kind of team. We come together to talk about literacy. As a grade level, we look at how our progress monitoring is going, how our intervention block is going, and how we're moving kids based on needs. And then we look like, how long have they been here? Do they need more supports? And then we all get to talk about the kids at the same time. And so it's teachers share kids, and the interventionists are there too. So then we can decide, well, 2 talk time during that time. And then for like tier 3 kids, then that becomes a separate conversation. And that's usually less kids that we're talking about. Because most of our kids are falling out at the tier 2 or tier 1 or 4. So.
I think another strength that I see that happens, Sylvia, and that kind of goes back to what Steve was saying. So because of the way the structure is set up and everybody's at the table, then what I also see happening is people feeling comfortable, like asking for what they need. And then Sylvia has a ton of expertise in reading that all teachers don't necessarily have right now. So what I've seen her do is be able to provide some scaffolds and support just very naturally. So teachers don't even really have to ask for it. Like it's just provided. And then I'm sure teachers, kind of pick and choose what they use based on their own understandings and capacity, but it's the way that you just put the resources out there and provide some like real quick coaching around differentiation in a really simple way. So instead of like, Sylvia could teach hours long classes about reading development, but she doesn't have time. There's not time for that, right? But that's what kids need. And so you kind of found a nice happy medium of a way to provide some of that information to your teachers so that ultimately kids can access what they need.
But they do have a system also for allowing that large amount of time to occur to have those, right? And so
Right, yeah.
it's how many times a month? Once a
So
month?
it's like
Every 6 weeks.
a couple hours that the team meets every 4 to 5 weeks, where we're looking at data, making decisions about that, and then we use that 2-hour block of time to and some of that little PD time in there. And then if we also need to talk about behavior, then our behavior disciplines and we kind of deal with those issues as well. So it's like one-stop shopping. Like
So
get
it
it all
does,
done,
yeah.
it's real deep, it's like quick, but.
And it does require substitutes, which then cause other system planning to need to happen from the behavior lens. And so
Yeah.
like, these are all big picture system things.
Our plan is to like really develop a different calendar so that we're doing that on a day that's more student contact. That would be ideal.
That's actually why your calendar at Bond is put designed the way it is to be able to accommodate that kind of work. I don't know how it's being used, but that's what, that's why it's crazy like that. That's why it's a
And
weird
I
calendar.
think that's kind of what they're going to, but like I think they have a vision of what they want and then kind of where we're coming from, and they haven't overlapped
Yeah,
yet.
yeah.
So,
Well, and there's a calendar planning committee going on in the district right now, and it's like all the time. But I think one of the conversations, look at the research about time it takes staff to build a skill or learn about something, it's 50 hours a month. And we don't have that, right? You take any calendar we currently have, we don't have that. And so it's back to that idea that as we're going to build calendars for the entire school year, we need to be thinking about these conversations. When are we doing this? And my staff is constantly, Steve, you're stretching me thin. And I'm pushing, appreciate my work, but I think we got to take a look at this concept if we really want to make any kids. What does it look like on a calendar?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. I look at some of my staff at East, and, we have teachers who are on our instructional leadership team. They're the PLC facilitator for their grade level PLC. They're on our restorative practices implementation team. And then they also coordinate our web leaders, and they're doing a sphere. And so when you ask them to do one more thing, they look at you like, please. There's just no more. So I think too, and it may sound strange to say it, but part of it too is also teaching the teachers, you can't do everything and be everything for every kid. Also, because I see a lot of where our systems at East start to break down, is people are so stressed out and they're so tired that they're not able to dedicate that time. So then I think that, to me, there also has to be some training for the teachers on where are your strengths, where can where can this really be useful? Because when you're trying to do everything, then we end up in a place where we're not doing the things that we need to do well. And you take that, you combine it, especially at the middle school level, on the high school level, with the calendar constraints and the time constraints that we have. And I think that's one of those structural pieces that makes some of the systems building a little more complicated.
leadership piece on that as well. And we went through the same two or 3 years ago when we went through it. We laid down sticky notes. What is everything we're doing in this building? We had like 57 things that we were going to do. And like, really need to do. We have a first. And all of our services are like that. All of our kids are playing with them. ESS, C3s, places, we do nothing else. We just say, throw it all out and focus on 2 things. A couple of years from now, we'll look back and say, yeah, what I did was not a good idea. I don't know. But it's the same thing. I've got people, we used to have people on 50 things. And now I've said, pick one. And of course you're on PSC. But pick one. There's very nice. It's helping. It's still not.
Because it seems like once you open up, space for time, and something from somewhere comes in and takes that time. Right? That's one of the things that comes up when we're talking to any of our MTSS teams is time. Time is always a big issue. Like when are we going to do this? Before school, after school? Like we have meetings every single morning. We have meetings every single afternoon. Our planning time is taken up with this. So when is going to happen during lunch? It can't. And so that's one of those things that I completely agree with you guys. It's so difficult, but if we can find a system that works, and maybe it needs to come from, up above, down, or from the administrative level. Hopefully we can.
And that's part of what we're going to spend more time talking about in our meeting today is doing some thinking around what would it look like, what could be possible, and some things that could be possible soon, and some things that maybe are next year thing, but that we're thinking about now, because if we don't start thinking about them now, we're still not going to have it next year.
So we talked about problem-solving structures. Some of the other frameworks that we have would be preventative systems that are in place. What kind of preventative systems are you seeing within your buildings, or are you using? Yes. I don't know what you guys do, but PBIS was a big thing at Crawford. We would try to do a lot of proactive incentives for kids, assemblies, things like that to get the students involved and to get them excited and to build relationships with them. Are there any other things that you're doing? Restorative justice, that's a great one, Steve.
Yeah, slowly but surely, we're getting the PBIS and restorative practices. Yeah, we'll get there. We have check and connect counselors now at UAS that have started to sort of get some of our kiddos that are like, all right, we're a little nervous, and we're a little concerned. And so so we have 2 and Hinckley has 2. And so if I understand the way it works correctly, our 2 that are at East right now will work with our at-risk 8th grade kiddos, work with them, do some groups and some problem solving and things of that nature. And then our 2 will go to Hinckley next year with those 8th grade kids to support them through 9th grade. And the 2 that are at Hinckley will come down to East, get a new group of 8th graders, and then they'll work with those 8th graders, and then they'll go back up things. So that is, I think that's one of the strongest.
Is that new this year?
It's new this year. East is one of the pilot schools for it.
That's a great example of a system perspective.
Yeah, to be using, and it's one of the, in terms of MTSS, it's one of the tier 2 toolbox interventions. So it's super duper linked. I think the hope is then to have someone who does 5th grade, who kind of works with some of the 5th graders, probably not at one school, but I know we pull from like Elkhart and Laredo, and 6th Avenue, I think, is the other one that they're looking at, so that there will be people who will go work with those 3 schools and then transition those kids into 6th grade. I think that's part of the next step of the pilot. That's probably a couple years out. But
6th grade.
But that's one of the systems that we were gifted by the district at East to be able to start check and connect counselors. And so that's one of the systems. That one has been received much better by the staff because it doesn't necessarily require a lot of extra time on their part to have this work. Whereas PBIS and restorative practices, we're working on it. But that's one of the systems that I think may be one of the biggest ones. How did you not know this?
I'm not very intelligent.
You are super.
Not true.
No, I honestly, I didn't even heard what we were doing. So-
And I don't know if it's just East and Hinkley. I
And there's
wanna,
who we can ask.
I wanna say that there's,
I feel like, I overheard a conversation about this earlier today. I feel like they might be looking at another school too. I don't have any idea what the
well, I
school
wanna
is.
say that it's part of that it might also be part of the turnaround for Aurora Central. One of its feeders was part of the conversation that I heard.
That's really cool. Any other ones before we move forward?
We kind of do a little bit of all of those things in there for the academic piece. Specifically reading, but we do have an intervention log, we do call out deployment, all hands on deck with everybody having a group, so as many people as we can have, because that's going to be more differentiated grouping of kids. We do provide coaching to teachers, sitting alongside them, and we're doing some of the intervention testing as well. Problem solving around that. We do follow it up with after school intervention as well. And using that stuff, which is trying to pair the teams read naturally at first grade group. So that she could have a group during this deployment time that we have. So just really focus, targeting what we're using and what that might look like for the kids. It could be different, it's not always the same thing for everybody.
And I think, I love the idea of training some of our classified staff to do some of these things. I know in a lot of schools, like, there's a fear around that. But if you think about, like, if you walked into a job every day and then basically you weren't trusted to provide instruction in a school, does that make you feel like a valued member of it? I mean, it would make me just feel like I'm a monitor at that point. Not that they're not valuable as well, but a few years ago when we started doing the LLI with some of the interventionists, or the paraprofessionals, it was like, they were getting excited about it. It was like, wow, I feel like I'm a real teacher. And it's like, well, you're not like a real teacher, you're a real teacher, you know? You just didn't have the skills before. And so you can really empower your staff on that. Any others? All right. You know, prevention, it's huge. Right now, we have a really reactive system, and obviously it's not doing us too well. So we got to start coming up with some preventative measures. So, are your systems developed? Are they matched up with your data? Do you feel like the things that you have in place are supporting the needs that you have within your building? Here we have an imaginary elementary school, and there's their data, right? We have 567 students, and only 33% are proficient. Now, it's imaginary, but that's some of our schools at this point, right?
So it's imaginary because we made up the total student number, but Bruce and I did take data from a real elementary school and use their percentages. And when we get to the next page 2, we took real data in terms of percentages. So even though it's imaginary, it's really not so imaginary.
Just the names
Well, we
and
do
then-
have one of the highest, in the state, we have the highest number, one of the highest numbers of replans.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's in the thousands.
Yep.
So within this system, right, they have, can you guys see this?
Mm-hmm.
You can? Okay. Well, then I'm not going to read to you. Just look at it. I'll read to my daughter at bedtime. So does their system match their data? Their IST system.
So what to do, students, is
Right.
Right?
You'll never catch up to.
No.
It's psychiatric.
I mean, this is like putting a Band-Aid on, a major flesh wound here. We can help out those kids, and that's great for those kids, but what about, the other, what do we got? 36 to 54? What about the other, 300 kids that are just still struggling and not getting the supports that they need? And so that's where we need to start thinking outside of the box, and
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
So, and this is this confusion about what goes to an ISD team and what doesn't. So when you say 36 to 54, you're well within that percentile of tier 2, right? So, 80% first instruction. So is the assumption that because 380 kids are not proficient, all 380 are supposed to be brought from the IST?
No.
The assumption is that all 380 need us to look really differently, probably at what we're doing.
Right.
It may need a more
Not necessarily
intentional.
through IST.
No,
Right.
Okay, that's, okay,
Yeah.
I was feeling a little confused there.
No, that's a very good point to bring.
Because what I'm seeing is, again, is there a clear understanding building-wide of what universal best practices are? So what is that instructional model that's being utilized?
Yes.
And as I have recently learned that there's a very different model for math than there is for literacy. So are we also in a system where we're trying to apply the same instructional model across content areas as opposed to looking at instructional models that are designed for specific content areas to best produce results for students? So that's what I see when I look at that, is it's not so much, PLCs that are focused mainly on best practices, but are they following those instructional models? Are they doing the teaching and learning cycle? It's great to look at data and track data, but are you digging into that data? Are you looking at if you're looking at, for example, I know right now in literacy, we're talking about pulling main points to be able to analyze how an author got to those main points with informational text. And so, great, I know my students didn't do well on this formative assessment on that, but why didn't they do well? Kind of digging into that. Where are you making those links between the data and the standards? And then how are you going back and saying, okay, are you using deployment, or are you looking at saying, well, what should, Skylar's kids did really, really well. What strategies is Skylar using, and taking those strategies back to the other members of the PLC? So it seems like this is a lot of surface level work, but there's not a ton of really digging deeper and really looking into what's happening building wide, because it seems to be a much, much bigger issue than just that little bit.
For sure. And so, in part of our work actually within our community too is really taking a look at those universal best practices. Because honestly, I don't even know if our teachers would know what would be a tier 1 or what's a tier 2 or what is what. And so, defining that, coming up with those supports. Within both of those buildings, we set up the system around having a coach, or we call it a designated consultant. And so someone does bring a concerned student to the table, they meet with that person before they get to the whole NTSS team. Come on in. And then those two people sit down and problem solve some things and look, do you have your universal systems in place first? Because if you don't, let's start there, get some really good targeted instruction, some good work on those, and make sure that's solid. And then, if the student's still struggling, then let's look at, adding in some interventions for them at that point.
Well, I think, too, that we frequently say, okay, so what do you do? Well, we're going to use deployment. And someone says, okay, good. And that's where that conversation stops. And that's where PLC comes in. What does good deployment actually look like in practice?
Well, I think you have to figure out, where are your strong points on your PLCs? Like on my PLC, I'm the only one that has any intervention training at all in terms of literacy. Whereas Allison, who's another one of our teachers, she's unbelievably amazing at some of the writing skills and, and building some of those structures. So you have to know where everybody's skill sets are too, because it doesn't do any good to send a kiddo who's struggling with fluency and word attack to a teacher who has no idea how to teach fluency and word attack. Where everybody's going to sit along together and twiddle their thumbs, and nobody's going to get any better.
If I heard one more person say, yes, I do small group instruction.
What does that look like?
Do in this way. Pulling two people together at a table is not necessarily small group instruction.
And is it effective? So yeah, and those are great points. One of the things that we try to talk about is asset mapping. Like what do you have within your building? Where are your experts? Where are your supports? And how are they being utilized? You might have a stellar 5th grade teacher that's, knows all the ins and outs of reading, but all they're seeing is their own homeroom. And so that resource is just kind of being really isolated. So how can we get that person out there to support some of our teachers that need some extra help? So here's some more data from our imaginary elementary school. There were total number of students, their proficiency levels, or how many are proficient a year behind, 2 years behind. So again, it gets a little bit deeper and deeper as we go through.
And so I think, can you go back?
Yeah, sorry.
So I think this data is where we start to get into some different conversations, and this is where we want to push your thinking in a minute. So I am a firm believer in solid universal instruction and in starting there, and that being really critical. And when we have kids who are 2, 3, or more years behind, I also am a firm believer that universal instruction alone isn't going to close that gap. And then when we have, even right here, if you just look at that 48 and 49, we have 100 kids that are 2 years behind. Yes, universal instruction, and we got to do something else, probably tier 2, and it's probably not going to work to just use a traditional IST structure one at a time. So that's where we're saying we want to start thinking differently about what else can we do, how else can we design systems, and some of your schools have already made some moves and done some shifting along this realm, but what else can we do and what are other ways to think about designing systems, and how can we use, some of my schools are just shifting and they still have an IST, but they're just using the time differently than they used it before. Instead of talking about one kid, they're bringing their data from their PLCs and they're talking about a group of kids and playing an intervention group versus just one. So that's where the conversation is, not to say that everybody, needs an intensive intervention, but we do have to really look at our data and figure out how we're going to close the gaps.
A district conversation, too, I like to go back the other direction. There is no formal re-intervention curriculum at the secondary level.
Very aware
There
of
is
that.
no formal intervention curriculum at the secondary level. There are pieces of things.
Yeah.
But, to be able to physically have something and train somebody in, as well as having that person, I mean, here are 2 people with great reading skills in this room, that's a rarity at a secondary level. It really is. Because literature training is a standard practice in the college handbook. So.
Well, and I think too, one of the struggles that I've faced, at least at East, is because, some of it is just the high level of sort of inconsistent attendance and things of that nature that we deal with on a pretty consistent basis. But, we start looking at kids who are 3 and 4 years behind. I have 8th graders, and I have the sped co-op classes, so to some extent it's a little bit different. But I have 8th graders, or I have the sped co-op classes, I have to start letting go. Having a hard time letting go.
They'll always be yours.
They'll always be fine. I'm having a hard time with this. Like Bayaz is like, we're gonna get a new literacy teacher, I'm like, but then I have to leave them.
Does everyone know, so Leah is transitioning from an ESS teacher to now she's going to be the MTSS coordinator for East. So,
Leah's
it's
like
like,
anxiety around it.
Well, I used to be a special ed teacher, so was Carrie. Well, you still are.
And so I look at my sped kids a little bit differently, but even within those co-op classes, because what I see happen very often is, okay, so these are the sped kids, so we're going to automatically assume that they're lower across the board. So we're going to put all the other low kids in there with the sped kids, which to some extent, makes a little bit of sense because they can probably use some of the same intervention and skill building. But on top of that, we're also going to give you all of our kids with the behavior problems. So let's just put them all in one set together. And so you have these kids with these very different issues. And most of us know that when you have a lot of behavior issues, a lot of that comes back to the frustration at the academic level, not being struggling with doing something and being really frustrated. But when you're then adding to, you're adding to your sped kids and the supports and the graphic organizers and the structures that you do for them, and you try, you do those as well for your quote unquote gen ed kids. But then with your gen ed kids, you're also looking at 3 and 4 years behind on grade level and trying to put in some of those tier 2 interventions as well. And so that's a very intense demographic to really look at.
So part of what we want to, we're going to do some defining in a moment, but part of what we want to start thinking about as we dig into the data is where do we want to start with that data? And when we start to look at the at-risk data for our secondary schools in particular, we can really start sorting out by, it's really interesting, who are our kids? It seems like, and we do have a significant number of kids who have attendance issues. When we really started sorting the data, we've got a cluster who have attendance issues and who are also struggling. We also have these large clusters that are coming every day to us and are struggling. And so really fleshing out and helping teachers flesh out, because when you're teaching, it feels like it's everyone. It feels like no one is showing up and oh my goodness. And so how can we start using the data to really help us guide and decide where do we start? Where do we start to tackle the challenges that we're seeing?
And one of my non-SPEC kids is on the at-risk kids list. Never in a million years, based on what I see in class, based on his academic ability, based on the fact that he has never missed a day of school, would I ever think that he's one of the at-risk kids. At the same time, I'm going, now that makes sense. This piece of what I didn't understand is now making more sense to me.
Yeah, and that's where we gotta look at the whole child, right? All those different aspects and different pieces of it. Would you guys like to join the tables? We're kind of having like a group discussion.
very
I'm going to duck out in a few minutes.
Okay, all right, that's fine.
Thank you.
So while John's here, John, how often do you check Tableau? Just curious.
Oh, like 18 times a day.
What about
so
time?
I'm like constantly surfing Tableau. I may know more about your school than you do at this point, but it's such a resource for me because it is a place what's beautiful is you can go there and see growth. I mean, that's what I love about it, right? So we're talking about going and identifying issues, but I also love to go there and see the decreases in behavioral issues at Columbia first quarter of this year and the increase in attendance, right? And so there's this, it allows you to go, oh, what's going on? How are things? You know, it allows you to ask different questions without wondering why things always seem good or seem bad. It says, let's start the conversation from this data about a student, because I might see something that I'm wondering about, and it's just that I'm wondering about it. It allows you to ask that question, and then you can get to the real story behind what you're wondering. So I am a Tableau addict, and I want to be acknowledged for that. And it's just, for me, it is quick indications and allows my mind to begin to ask questions about what might be happening. It is never the answer. Because I looked at it yesterday, 2 days ago, and I said, oh, we're in huge trouble with on-track numbers at the high schools. Well, 2 schools hadn't rolled over their quarter data yet, right? So, and I felt a little foolish going, oh, no, we're not, right? Let's just get the real data. But we have really good stories to begin to wonder about and tell based on the fact that we can look not at big chunks of data, but at smaller pieces of data that matter.
I bring it up because I told him how you check it every 2 hours. So when the meeting just
I didn't do that. I can hardly wait until tomorrow. The data changes just a little tiny bit.
So that just sparked a conversation. Sorry to call you out, John. To get it going? Or to go back?
Okay. So we are going to move now to some of the discussion that you guys just made. Some of the discussion you guys already started and already went to when you were talking about even calendars and time structures and all of those things. Then to really thinking about designing, if we think about our data and we start to think about what the data is telling us and where our kids are at, what they need, how might we think about designing systems based on that versus what we thought an IST had to look like or what we thought a PLC had to look like. And so we're going to use a little bit of a design thinking model. And so how many of you have done official design thinking before?
But you got to do it, all right?
It's a great experience, even just to meet Hi Howard who facilitates it. Many experiences in our district, it is the most fascinating time to spend with him. But we're going to use these premises of design thinking to just help you push outside of the box and kind of let go of some of the constraints that we tend to have when we think about things in schools. So traditionally, we sort of assume we know what people need and feel and why, and oftentimes that's out of like the sense of urgency we have. And so instead of that, we're going to talk to each other, and we're going to ask why a lot. So when we get to the next couple slides, we're going to be asking some questions, and they are not like accusatory questions. They're really questions to just get us reflecting and start thinking about our practice and why we do the things we do. Often we move quickly towards solutions, again, because of this sense of urgency and like, oh my goodness, we look at the data, sometimes we panic and decide to just act. What we're going to encourage you to do today is deliberately just take a moment to define what is our real challenge. Is it actually that no one's coming to school and so we can't do anything about it because they're not here? Well, then we start looking, oh, maybe that's not actually the challenge. Maybe it's this or maybe it's that. So asking more questions to really determine what our challenge really is and what we're actually trying to plan a system for. We often use our own ideas for solutions because we all think we have great ideas. And again, it's that sense of urgency. We get trapped in this like, oh my gosh, we have to solve the problem this minute, rather than hearing what other people are doing. And then we're going to move away from having that judgmental, like we can't, but there's this, but there's that, to the idea of we can't if. So what we're really going to push you to do is think outside of the box and think about like, if we did this, we could solve for this. If we shifted this time here, we could. As you get into this, depending on your mindset and where you're at, you can think future-oriented, like I can't imagine changing anything right now, but I can think about second semester, or I can think about different structures for the future. Some of you will be able to go into, what about this structure we already have? Like, what if we just shifted what we're doing with that time? So we already have this time. We know what we're doing with it isn't quite solving. Maybe we use it differently. So I'm going to encourage you to try to think with the time and resources you currently have, but how to adjust them, perhaps, to better meet your needs.
And a lot of you have shared things that have gone that way, right? You're not using a traditional MTSS system, but you're thinking outside of the box to meet the needs of your students. So with your, identifying kids through the PLCs and then, using the designated coaches to kind of intervene ahead of time. So it's already there, right? We're just going to draw it out.
Just gonna keep pushing forward because some of the things you're already doing. So we just wanted to give a quick reminder of what we think success looks like and what it really looks like, and to remind you that it's messy. And if you walk away from here, or if you already came into here feeling like, oh my gosh, it's a mess, we're trying this and we're doing this, and that's okay. That's part of the process. That's what it looks like when we're trying to find our way to changing outcomes for kids. Okay, so the first part of the design thinking process is really to empathize with your user. In our case, our users are us, our teachers who are using these systems, administrators, and so we just want you to think, none of this is to like make you feel bad, none of this is like, oh, why are you doing what you're doing? It's to really, because we get so busy and we get so caught up in the urgency of things that sometimes we forget to stop and think like, wait a minute, why am I doing this? Do I think that I have to do it this way? Did I think that this was what Jake wanted and so we did it this way because we thought this was what Jake said we had to do? Oh, well maybe, wait, Jake didn't ever say that. Well, maybe we can stop doing this. So a great example of this, I had a teacher when I was in an administrative role in a building who the previous principal had some expectation around planning that was not at all related to any of the work we were doing. So she was trying to do all the new work we were doing, and then she was still, I can't even remember what it was, she was still spending hours of time on this other thing. And so finally she came and was like, do you guys care if I'm doing this? Like, do you ever want to see it? And I was like, well, how's it helping your kids? Is it helping you plan? Is it helping move your students forward? And she's like, no, but I just thought I had to do it. And then I realized, like, wait, no one has asked about this in 6 months. Why am I? And it was just that moment of clarity, like, wait, why am I spending my time here? This isn't actually meeting the needs of my kids. And then it freed up, like, this whole bulk of time. Some of it she could perhaps sleep and do other things, but she really became more effective in some other pieces of planning as well, because it just freed up this whole part of her life she was using for something that wasn't really working, right? So it's just that thinking. So just take some time.
And I think that touches upon what Steve was saying, right? We have 10 million different programs and different committees that we're involved into. And is it supporting our greatest need, right? So let's drop some of those and let's get really, focus really hard on those three aspects that we're going to.
So depending on your personal style, either talk at tables or you can just reflect on your own if you prefer not to share some of these things. But just think about current structures that you have in place. What's currently going on and kind of why is it? Your answer could be why, because we're getting really great success. Brilliant. That's not something you're going to change it, right? So this doesn't also have to be that it's a bad thing. It's just asking why. I'm going to pull you guys along to continue this thinking just so we can get to the part where you're really thinking about systems. So once you think about kind of what are the systems we have and why, hopefully you just at least got to a place where you're thinking like, okay, well we have the systems we have because they're working and we just need to keep refining and tweaking those. Great. Or we have the systems we have because we made adjustments from last year and we think this system's going to work better and so we want momentum with this. Or I don't know why this is the way we've always done it. It's not quite working, but we're not sure what else to do and so that's why we have it, because of time or because of, so hopefully you're just at least to a place where you've wrapped your head around kind of where are you at with the systems you have? Are they purposeful, intentional? Do you want to stick with them? Do you want to start thinking a little differently? The next piece is to really clearly define your challenge. So thinking about your systems, thinking about your data. Those of you at the secondary level, I'd like you to take a few minutes to really look at your at-risk data if you haven't looked at it in the previously. And really tightly identify where your challenge is. Where might you begin? Is it, I'm just going to leave it at that. So we're going to take about 5 minutes, define what you think, what is the challenge. And I heard some of the discussions start to happen already. And you can really return right to where you're starting off. I'm just going to guide you through the next couple pieces that I want you to talk through. If you're not quite done defining, that's totally fine. So once you have defined, because some of you are there, the next step is this ideation phase where you just really think, again, let go of some of the limitations you feel might exist and really think about, okay, this is our data, this is the challenge that I've defined. What do we need? And you have to right in this place, stay in the we can if. Like we could solve for this if, okay, I need these players at the table, we would need to use some of our time for this. So let go of some of the constraints for now. Then, once you've come up with what you need, you can certainly refine and figure out what's doable now and what might be doable later and what might be things that need to be raised to different levels. Like Steve suggested, like there are some things you can solve in your building, some things that need to be raised to different levels for conversation, but all of that is important for us to hear. So if we don't have the conversation, we don't get the ideas out there, we don't know what's needed. So get into that piece. And that's more just the idea space, and then the last piece, not the total final piece, but the last piece that we want you to think about is actually then getting it into something concrete. So if you have this idea of people you would need at the table and kind of systems and things and data you would need and time, we want you to actually either draw out or write out or use some sticky notes. What would this system really truly look like? Can you get a vision of what it would look like? I'm going to push you to get as far through those pieces as you can. So you're defining, if you're not quite done defining, you're thinking, okay, if that's the challenge, what would we need in order to address that challenge? And then what would it actually really look like? You can use words, pictures, sticky notes, whatever works for you in your way of thinking to kind of capture what a system would look like. Okay?
And one of the things with this, whatever pops into your head,
Anything.
get it down there. Like even if it's like Superman swooping down and saving all the children, right? Like
Because Jake likes to wear capes and so.
Keep in mind, my MP is Gelman, who, has Spider-Man on his wall, so.
Exactly. See? Anything's possible. But really try to keep that open mindset right now. Pull you back together to kind of wrap things up. The last step of the design thinking process is that you test whatever you design. So as you're coming up with ideas, as you're thinking of things, there's lots of ways you can test things. You can actually try something and implement it with a really small group. I'd also encourage you just to go back and share your thinking with people in your building. Throw the thoughts and ideas out to other people and see how they respond to them. Just to keep the conversation going, even if you're not ready to change something tomorrow, how can you keep this conversation going and keep the thinking going and not just leave it here? I just want to leave you with this final little excerpt from the book, A Beautiful Constraint, which is really just about, again, thinking differently through the work that we do. And kind of took it out, so I had to cut some words out, but it says constraints can be fertile, enabling, and desirable. They're catalytic forces that stimulate exciting new approaches and possibilities. They can, in fact, make us more than we were rather than less than we could be. We should see in them beauty rather than the beast, and it is more important now than ever. And I think if we think about our data, we think about our kids, like we all know, yes, it's a challenge and we could think of it as a beast, but that's not going to get us anywhere. We know it's in front of us, we know we care about it, so really try to find the exciting opportunities in some of these challenges and the opportunity to really think at a whole new level and in a whole different way. And have a good evening. You're welcome to stay and chat or if you have questions for us.